The clock above the scrub sink read 2:47 a.m. Mark Sullivan held his hands under the faucet, water hot enough to sting, and stared at the mirror without seeing his own face. 6 hours surgery, ruptured spleen, 19-year-old kid, motorcycle versus guardrail. The kid would live. Mark's hands had made sure of that. His hands always did what they were supposed to do. The rest of him was another matter. Down the hall, the vending machine dropped a can with its familiar thunk, that dull, metallic sound that had become the heartbeat of St. Jude Memorial after midnight. Someone on the nursing staff had taped a handwritten sign to the front panel years ago. "She takes your money, but she's loyal." Nobody remembered who wrote it. Nobody took it down. Mark turned off the water, reached for the paper towel dispenser. The fluorescent light above him buzzed a half-note flat, the way it always did between 2 and 4 in the morning, as though the building itself was running on fumes. Then he heard it. A scratching, light, rhythmic, steady as a metronome, nails on glass. He turned. The emergency department's rear entrance, a heavy glass door that opened onto the back parking lot, and the dumpsters and the 2 sad maple trees the hospital had planted during some forgotten beautification campaign, was fogged with condensation from the temperature difference between the heated corridor and the March night outside. Through the fog, a shape. Mark stepped closer. His sneakers, the old New Balance pair he kept for overnight shifts because they didn't squeak on linoleum, made no sound on the polished floor. A dog, a German shepherd, pressed against the glass. Its belly hung low, grotesquely distended against a body that was all ribs and ridge and jutting hip bones. The coat was matted in thick, uneven patches, mud, maybe, or dried blood. Impossible to tell in the half-light. Its left ear was torn, not ragged, not chewed. A clean split, straight down the middle, the kind of wound that doesn't come from another animal. The dog was not barking, not whining, not panting. It was scratching. One paw, right front, lift, drag, against the glass. Patient, measured, like knocking on a door and being willing to knock all night. Mark stood 3 feet from the glass, and the dog's eyes found his. Brown, clouded. The whites, faintly yellow. Dehydration. Infection. Exhaustion. Maybe all 3. He had seen eyes like that in the ICU, in patients whose bodies were shutting down but whose minds hadn't agreed to it yet. The look of someone running on something deeper than adrenaline. The dog held his gaze, did not look away, did not tilt its head or flatten its ears in submission, just looked at him, steady and direct, with an expression Mark Sullivan, who had delivered bad news to families for 15 years, who had watched the light leave more eyes than he could count, had never quite seen before. Not begging, demanding. The scratching stopped. The paw rested against the glass, trembling now, and Mark could see the nails worn almost to the quick, some cracked and dark with dried blood. This dog had walked a long way, on concrete, on asphalt, on whatever surface lay between wherever it had come from and this back door. The belly contracted. A visible ripple passed across the distended abdomen, and the dog's back legs buckled for half a second before locking again. A contraction. Mark knew the mechanics, different species. Same physics. This dog was in labor. This dog had walked, limped, dragged, crawled to a hospital, in the middle of the night, in the cold, and scratched on the glass door of the emergency department. Not for food, not for warmth. Mark pressed his palm flat against the glass. On the other side, the dog's nose touched the same spot. 1 inch of cold glass between his skin and hers. Her. He could see it now. The swollen teats. The way she held her weight favoring the right hind leg, which was swollen at the knee and angled slightly wrong. An old injury healed without setting. She had been living with that pain for months. Maybe longer. Behind him. Footsteps. Sarah Miller came around the corner holding 2 charts and a pen between her teeth. She stopped when she saw Mark standing at the back door with his hand on the glass. She pulled the pen from her mouth, looked past him, saw the dog. Sarah had been a nurse for 14 years, night shift ER for 8 of those. She had seen gunshot wounds, overdoses, a man who walked in carrying his own severed finger in a sandwich bag. Very little made her pause. She paused. Her eyes went to the dog's left ear, that clean, deliberate tear, and her jaw tightened, then down to the belly. The trembling legs, the worn nails. Mark, she said. Not a question, just his name. Spoken the way you speak when you need someone to know you see what they see. Mark didn't look away from the dog. I need a hand with something, he said. Sarah set the charts on the hallway chair. Didn't ask with what. Mark reached for the door handle. The cold hit him first, that Pacific Northwest March cold that isn't dramatic, isn't snow or ice, just a damp, bone deep chill that finds every gap in your clothing and settles there. The dog backed up 2 steps when the door swung open. Exactly 2, not fleeing, repositioning. Just outside, arms reach the precise distance of an animal that has learned, through repetition, that human hands mean pain. Mark sat down on the concrete step. The cold soaked through his scrub pants immediately. He didn't reach out, didn't call, didn't make kissing sounds or baby talk. Just sat. The dog watched him. 10 seconds. 20. Then she came forward, 1 step. Nose working the air between them, reading him the way she read everything. By scent and instinct and whatever calculus a wounded animal runs when deciding whether this human is different from the last one. Her nose touched his knee, dry, warm. She looked up at him once more. Then she lay down, right there, on the cold concrete step of St. Jude Memorial Hospital, at 2:53 in the morning, with 5 lives inside her and an infection slowly killing her from within. She lay down, and she waited, because she had done her part. She had walked here. Whatever came next was up to him. Mark looked at Sarah, standing in the doorway with the warm light behind her. Get me some clean towels, he said quietly, and call Laura Beckett. If this story reached you tonight, we'd love to know. Drop a comment and tell us where you're reading from. As the old saying goes, good stories, like good people, were meant to be shared. Mark carried her inside. She was lighter than a German shepherd should be, 60 pounds, maybe less, where a healthy female her age would carry 80. His arms registered each rib through the matted coat, hard and distinct as piano keys under a threadbare cloth. Sarah had already moved ahead. The old sterilization room at the end of the East Corridor decommissioned last year when the hospital cut its surgical budget, now used for storing surplus IV stands and boxes of expired hand sanitizer, had a clear patch of floor near the back wall. Sarah spread surgical towels across the linoleum, snapped on the overhead fluorescent. It flickered once, caught, held, under the light. Everything sharpened. The scars along Bella's right flank ran in parallel lines, 4, 5, 6 of them thin, evenly spaced. The kind of pattern that doesn't happen by accident or in a fight. Something narrow, something swung with regularity. The hair had grown back white over each one, like fault lines in dark earth. Her right hind knee was swollen to twice its normal size. The joint canted at an angle that meant it had broken and mended without anyone's help, the bone finding its own crooked way back together. Every step she'd taken tonight had cost her. Mark set her down on the towels. Her head dropped immediately, chin flat on the floor, eyes half open, breathing shallow and fast. His fingers moved to her lower abdomen and found what he'd suspected since the parking lot. A wound below the last rib on the left side, not fresh, but not healing. The tissue around it had gone a bruised purple-black, the edges soft and wet where they should have been dry. The smell rose, faint and sweet necrotic tissue, the body consuming itself one cell at a time. Bella made a sound when he touched the wound margin. Low. Flat. Barely a vibration in her throat. Not a yelp, something past yelping. The sound of a body that had stopped sorting pain from breathing. Mark sat back, looked at Sarah. Sarah looked back. 5 seconds of nothing but the fluorescent hum and the faint drip of condensation somewhere behind the wall. Sarah's voice came low and even. She made it here on foot, like that. She dragged herself here for those pups. Mark nodded, reached for the supply cabinet saline, gauze, broad-spectrum antibiotics from emergency stock, first aid only. The wound needed a real vet. Down the hall, room 312. A light was on. It was always on at this hour. Harold Jennings sat upright against his pillows, fingers curled around the bed rail, staring at a window that gave him nothing but his own reflection and the orange blur of parking lot lights. The night nurse had written in his chart an hour ago, patient refuses sleep medication. States he does not trust what shows up when he closes his eyes. Harold heard something faint, muffled by corridors and a fire door. A sound he couldn't place but that pulled his head around for the first time in hours. He listened. It didn't come again, but he kept listening. Sarah was already dialing. 3:14 in the morning. Thumb finding a name she hadn't called in weeks. Laura Beckett. Renton Animal Clinic. Friend since nursing school. The kind of friend who picked up at any hour because she kept the same brutal schedule as everyone else in emergency medicine. 2 rings, a voice. Sleep roughened but alert underneath. This better be good, Sarah. I need you at St. Jude, East Corridor. Old sterilization room. German Shepherd. Female. Late-stage pregnancy. Labor starting. She's got a necrotic wound on her left lower abdomen, been festering for weeks by the look of it. Malnourished, dehydrated. Old injuries everywhere I look. A lamp clicking on, bed springs shifting. How bad is the necrosis? Sarah glanced at Mark. He held up his hand, thumb and forefingers spread 3 inches apart. The wound margin, 3 inches at least. Tissue soft, purple-black. The smell is already there. She conscious, Laura. She walked here, on a hind leg that healed wrong months ago. She walked here and scratched on the back door. A shorter pause this time. The sound of a zipper, a bag being packed. I can be there by 5:30 if the bridge cooperates. Keep her warm. Saline sub-Q, slow drip. Clean the wound margins with saline and pack with wet gauze. Nothing else. And tell your surgeon friend first aid only that necrosis needs proper debridement under sedation. If he cuts into the wrong layer, he'll push her into septic shock. You hear me? Loud and clear. 5:30, maybe sooner. The line went dead. Sarah relayed the instructions to Mark in 3 clipped sentences. He was already laying out supplies, saline bags, an IV catheter from the emergency stock, a stack of sterile gauze pads, human gauge catheter, slightly too large for the vein, but workable. His hands moved with the automatic precision that 15 years in surgery had drilled into them. The same sequence of motions, whether the patient weighed 60 pounds or 200. He slid the catheter into the vein on Bella's front left leg. She flinched a single involuntary jerk, then went still. The saline started its slow descent, drop by drop, each one catching the fluorescent light on its way down. Mark flushed the wound margins, gentle, letting the saline do the work instead of his fingers. The dead tissue at the edges was soft as wet paper, pulling away in small fragments that swirled in the clear liquid. Underneath, faint, but visible, the pink of living tissue, still there, still holding. He packed the wound with wet gauze and taped it loosely. First aid. Beckett's territory started where his competence ended, and he knew the line. Bella's breathing changed. Faster, shallower. Her abdomen contracted harder than the first one he'd seen on the steps. A visible wave rolling from her ribs downward. Her back legs stiffened. Her head lifted off the floor for the first time since he'd set her down. And she twisted to look at her own belly with an urgency that needed no translation. Now. Not in 2 hours, when Laura Beckett would arrive with proper equipment and proper sedation and 20 years of knowing exactly what to do with a dog in distress. Now. Mark sat back on his heels. He was a trauma surgeon. He had rebuilt shattered femurs, clamped bleeding arteries. And once his second year of residency, stuck in traffic on the Aurora Bridge, delivered a human baby in the back of an ambulance with nothing but gloves and a pocket knife to cut the cord. Different species, different scale. The physics didn't change. Contraction, pressure, passage. He looked at Sarah. She was pulling on fresh gloves. "We're doing this," she said. No inflection. The way she said everything that mattered. Mark gloved up, positioned himself. The contractions were closing in every 90 seconds, then 60. Bella panted between them, tongue out, sides heaving. The IV bag swung gently on the makeshift stand Sarah had rigged from a coat rack. The first pup crowned at 3:41 a.m., small, wet. Dark fur slicked flat against a body no bigger than Mark's fist. It slid onto the towel and lay motionless. 1 second. Bella twisted and licked rough. Urgent strokes, clearing the membrane. The pup shuddered, drew breath, cried, thin, reedy. The sound of something impossibly small declaring itself. Sarah lifted it gently, cleared the airway with a gauze-wrapped finger, dried it, set it against Bella's belly. It latched in seconds. Mark exhaled. 1. The second contraction hit before the breath was finished. Bella bore down, rigid, and the second pup came faster, bigger. Already squirming before it cleared, Sarah caught it, cleaned, placed it beside its sibling, 2. The third arrived at 3:58, smaller, quieter, but breathing. Bella didn't raise her head this time. Her eyes found Mark half open, losing focus. The pupils uneven, and the look in them had changed. Not the demand from the glass door, not the patience of the concrete steps. Something closer to a question she was afraid to ask. The fourth pup came at 4:11, and it nearly ended everything. Bella's body sees not the rolling wave of the first 3 deliveries, but a full contraction that pulled every muscle taut at once. Her spine lifting off the towels, her front paws scrambling against the linoleum. The pup emerged hind legs first. Breech. Mark guided it with 2 fingers, easing the shoulders through while the rest of the body followed in a slow, resisting slide. Sarah held Bella's head, one hand behind her ear, the other flat against her neck. Talking not words, just the sound. Just the low, steady presence of a human voice giving the dog something to anchor to besides the pain. The pup was alive. Sarah cleaned it, set it with the others. Or small bodies pressed against their mother, eyes sealed, mouths working. Bella did not push again. Her head lay flat, chin on the linoleum. Not the towel she had slid off it during the last contraction, and nobody had repositioned her. Her breathing had gone thin and rapid, 40 breaths a minute and climbing. The shallow panting of a body running calculations it wouldn't share. Her eyes were open, but the focus had emptied out of them. Pupils wide and dark and drifting. Mark's hand moved to her abdomen, pressed gently. The faint firm shape was still there one more. Low and to the right. Still inside. And the necrotic wound was weeping through the gauze, a thin line of pinkish-brown fluid tracing down her flank. Her body was fighting on two fronts and losing ground on both. The fluorescent above them flickered. A half-second of darkness, the old ballast catching, releasing, catching again. In that half-second, Mark's hand stopped moving, not because of the dark, but because of what it unlocked. The same flicker. A different room, 4th floor, 11:47 p.m. A Tuesday in November 2 years ago. Claire on the table, 39 weeks. The emergency C-section that became something else when the hemorrhage started and refused to stop. He hadn't been operating. You don't cut on your own wife. But he'd been at her head, holding her hand. He remembered the flicker that night, too, and what came after it. The feel of her fingers warm, then less warm, then loose. Not dramatic, not the way it happens in movies. Just a slow release of pressure, like someone setting down something heavy. And then the monitor said what his hand already knew. The light caught, held. Mark was in the sterilization room. Bella was on the floor, saline and iodine, and the faint, sweet rot of the wound. 4 puppies making small wet sounds. Bella's eyes found his, brown, clouded. But she was still in there, still holding on to something Mark recognized because he had watched it leave another pair of eyes in another room, under the same stuttering fluorescent light, and had spent 2 years trying to forget what its absence looked like. He placed his hand on her head, between the ears, where the fur was thin enough to feel the warmth of skull beneath. "You're safe now," he said. Quiet. The same voice he used when a patient surfaced too early from anesthesia, calm, worn smooth by years of repetition. "I'm right here." He did not know who he was talking to. Bella's torn ear twitched. Her eyes held his 3 seconds. 4. Then her abdomen contracted. Not the violent heave of the 4th delivery. A slow, grinding, deliberate push. As if she had gathered whatever she had left, whatever reserve she'd been holding back for survival. For the walk home that would never come, and spent it. Every last unit of it. On this, the 5th pup slid onto the towel. The smallest. Dark, wet and flat. No bigger than a man's palm. It didn't cry. Sarah picked it up, cleared the membrane from its face, rubbed its chest with one finger, small circles. The technique she'd learned in neonatal rotation years ago for human infants who needed convincing. 5 seconds. Mark counted without meaning to. 10. The fluorescent hummed. The IV dripped. 15. Sarah's jaw set. Her finger kept moving. A sound, thin as thread. A cry, so faint it barely disturbed the air, more vibration than voice, more suggestion than sound. Sarah exhaled. Set the pup against Bella's belly. It found a teat, latched, trembled, breathed. 5. All alive. Bella's head sank into the towel. Her eyes closed, Her nose stayed pointed at the cluster of small bodies even now. Even with the infection leaking poison into her blood. Even with the leg and the scars and whatever dark road she had walked to reach this door. Pointed toward them the way a compass finds north. Not by decision. Mark leaned against the wall. The linoleum was cold through his scrubs. His gloved hands rested on his knees, smeared with fluid that wasn't human. The coffee he'd poured before the spleen surgery sat on the counter 3 hours cold, and he could smell it from here, bitter and stale, mixed with saline and the faint iron edge of new life. His eyes burned, not tears. Heat, something behind his sternum that had been solid and frozen for 2 years was fracturing at the edges, not melting, not yet, but cracking the way ice cracks before anyone notices the water underneath. At 5:22 a.m., the door opened. Laura Beckett walked in carrying a veterinary field kit over one shoulder and a drive-through coffee in her free hand. She took in the scene dog on the floor. 5 puppies nursing. IV line running from a coat rack. 2 humans in blood-smeared scrubs propped against opposite walls and set her coffee on the counter beside Mark's. She knelt, gloved up. Her hands moved with a different expertise specific. Practiced. Calibrated for the species on the floor. Necrotic tissue. Left flank. 3-inch margin minimum. Going to need debridement and IV antibiotics, real ones. Not whatever you pulled from the ER crash cart. She glanced at Mark. You two did all right. For a couple of people doctors. She peeled back the gauze, looked at the wound. Her hands slowed the way hands slow when they find something worse than they prepared for. How long has she been carrying this? Weeks, Mark said. Maybe longer. Beckett looked at Bella's face, the torn ear, the white scar lines on the flank, the knee that would never straighten. She pressed 2 fingers along the wound margin. Bella didn't flinch, didn't react at all. Beckett sat back, pulled off one glove, rubbed her eyes with the heel of her bare hand. Someone did this to her, she said. Flat, not a question. And she carried 5 pups to term like this, walked here on that leg. She shook her head once. I've been doing this 20 years. I don't know how she's still breathing. She pulled the glove back on, opened her kit, started working. Down the corridor, the hospital was stirring. Day shift in 40 minutes, gray light Seattle in March. Thin and non-committal had begun showing in the narrow window at the far end of the hall. And in room 312 Harold Jennings was sitting up. Not staring at the window this time. Staring at his door, cracked open 2 inches, the way the night nurse always left it, and listening. Something from deep inside the building, small, intermittent, not quite crying, not quite human. He pressed the call button. When the nurse appeared, he asked a question he had not asked once in 14 months at St. Jude Memorial. What's going on down there? The day shift arrived at 6:45. By 7:12, the whole hospital knew. It started with Jenny Kowalski, a lab tech who went to the old sterilization room to pull a box of expired hand sanitizer for the quarterly supply audit. She opened the door, saw a German shepherd on surgical towels with 5 puppies pressed to its belly, an IV drip rigged from a coat rack, and a woman she didn't recognize kneeling on the floor with a surgical tray, and backed out without a word. She didn't need one. The look on her face when she returned to the nurse's station told it. News in a small hospital doesn't travel by announcement. It travels by pitch, the particular drop in volume that signals something unusual but not dangerous. Passed from station to station in the shorthand of people who share a building's rhythms. 3 nurses from the morning shift went to look and came back smiling. Gerald Pratt, the environmental services supervisor, a precise, methodical man who had managed hygiene compliance since 2009, and kept a laminated copy of the county health code in his desk drawer, sat down and began composing an email to administration. Subject line: Unauthorized animal presence, East Wing. Eleanor Calloway heard the news at 7:40 during her morning blood pressure check. Room 215. 4 days post-op from a hip replacement. Her second in 11 years. The nurse mentioned it while pumping the cuff, trying to fill silence, the way morning nurses do with long-term patients. Something about a stray dog. Puppies. The sterilization room. Eleanor's hand closed around the nurse's wrist. The cuff was still inflating. Take me down there. Mrs. Calloway, you're really not supposed to. I didn't ask for a medical opinion, sweetheart. I asked you to wheel me down the hall. The nurse wheeled her. Eleanor sat in the doorway of the sterilization room for a long time without speaking. Bella was asleep, deep, heavy. The total surrender of a body that had been given permission to stop. Beckett had finished the debridement an hour ago. The proper IV antibiotics now running through a clean line. The 5 puppies lay clustered against Bella's belly, a pile of dark shapes rising and falling with each of her breaths. Eleanor's hands rested on the arms of the wheelchair. Still, her face gave nothing. She watched the way people watch who have lived long enough to know that some things don't require commentary. She turned to the nurse. Go get me another blanket. Not for me. Richard DeMaro had Gerald's email by 8 o'clock. 2 voicemails from the night custodian by 8:10. The tension headache arrived at 8:15, settling behind his left eye with the familiar pressure of a problem that wouldn't solve itself. He walked from the administrative wing to the east corridor with the stride of a man who had managed crises at an underfunded hospital for 2 decades and could identify the shape of a new one before he saw it. His tie was straight. His shoes were polished. His face held the composed neutrality of someone who understood that losing your composure in a hospital hallway was a luxury the administration couldn't afford. He stood in the sterilization room doorway. Bella was still asleep under Eleanor's blanket. Beckett was adjusting the antibiotic drip. Mark sat against the far wall. Same scrubs as last night. Circles under his eyes, dark enough to look painted on. Richard didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. His authority was structural, load-bearing, the quiet, immovable weight of a man who knew exactly how many things could fail in a building full of sick people and shrinking money. Mark, level, almost tired. You brought a dog into my hospital. Mark looked up. She brought herself. Richard's expression didn't shift. You know what I'm looking at, a health code violation that triggers a county inspection. A liability situation our insurance doesn't touch. My phone, which is going to ring in about 4 hours when Gerald's email reaches someone with authority. He paused, adjusted his tie once. A small pull at the knot. You've been here long enough to know how this goes. Mark said nothing. Because Richard wasn't wrong. St. Jude ran on the thinnest of margins. Every annual review felt like a coin toss. Every inspection a potential excuse for the county to redirect funding to the larger systems with lobbyists and PR departments and buildings where dogs didn't give birth in decommissioned rooms. Richard wasn't cruel. He was a man holding a structure together with policy. And he could feel the bolts loosening. 48 hours, Richard said. Find a shelter. Find a rescue. Find whatever you need to find. But in 48 hours, that dog and those puppies leave my hospital. Beckett stood up. She'd been silent until now, crouched beside Bella. One glove on and one dangling from her back pocket. She needs a minimum of 5 days on IV antibiotics, Beckett said. Her arms crossed. I debrided a significant area of necrotic tissue this morning. The infection is deep. You pull that IV and transport her before the course is done. You're looking at sepsis, organ failure, and 5 orphaned puppies. I'll put that in writing. On my letterhead. Richard looked at Beckett, looked at Mark, pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose. 48 hours. Mark, not 49. He turned and walked out. Measured steps, even pace. A man who had said exactly what he came to say. The 48 hours remade the East Corridor of St. Jude in ways nobody predicted. Eleanor came back that afternoon, and the next, she parked her wheelchair beside Bella's towels and stayed for hours. One hand on the dog's head, talking in the low, unhurried voice of someone telling stories she'd carried so long they'd worn smooth. A beagle named Biscuit. 30 years ago, how he slept at the foot of her bed every night and waited at the front door at 5:15 every evening, 5 minutes before her husband pulled into the driveway after his shift at the plant. How Biscuit kept waiting at 5:15 for 2 years after Tom died. Standing at that door, tail going, watching for headlights that never came. Eleanor didn't cry telling this. She told it the way old people tell stories that have become part of them, with weight but without edges. The sharp parts worn away by time and repetition until what remains is just the shape. Arthur Briggs appeared next. Room 308, 71, retired machinist, awaiting valve replacement surgery. A quiet man who spent his days watching the Weather Channel with the volume off. He asked a nurse to bring him down. He didn't touch Bella. Didn't speak to her. Sat in the doorway and watched the puppies sleep for 20 minutes. His hands folded in his lap, his face still. Then he asked to go back. That night, for the first time in 9 days, he didn't press the call button between midnight and 4. Harold Jennings, room 312, didn't come. But St. Jude was an old building with thin walls, and sound traveled through them the way water finds cracks in stone under fire doors, around corners, through the gaps where baseboard met floor. The puppies cried at night. Small, intermittent mews that carried through the corridor in the hours when everything else was quiet. Harold lay in his bed and listened. Not to the television, which he kept off. Not to his own breathing, which he usually counted to pass the time. To the puppies, small, distant, persistent. At some point, his eyes closed. The night nurse found him asleep at 3 a.m. during her rounds. She checked the time, checked the chart. 4 consecutive hours, the longest unbroken sleep in 14 months of admission. She wrote it down carefully. Patient sleeping, unprompted. No medication. She underlined, unprompted twice, and moved to the next room. Not connecting the faint sounds from the East Corridor to the old man, finally resting in 312. Mark made his phone calls in the spaces between early morning, late night. The dead stretches when the hospital ran on autopilot and he could step into the hallway with his cell phone and a list of numbers. 7 shelters. Every one within 30 miles of Seattle. Emerald City Animal Rescue Poll. 60 dog wait list. Sorry. Paws of Hope in Tacoma could maybe take 2 puppies. Not the mother. And not for another 3 weeks. Olympic Peninsula. Humane Society no room. Cascade Foster Network no room. A woman at a private rescue in Issaquah who listened to the whole story and then said, very gently, that she was already housing 42 dogs in a space built for 20. King County Humane Society would accept the entire family. 30-day hold policy. If nobody adopted within 30 days, the shelter reserved the right to make population management decisions. Mark understood what that phrase meant. Everyone in this line of work did. He put the phone down, stood at the window of the sterilization room. Bella was nursing lying on her side, 5 mouths pulling, her body giving what it had while the antibiotics dripped and the wound beneath the gauze slowly, stubbornly closed. Patient, steady, giving without arithmetic. Sarah appeared in the doorway. 2 paper cups from the hall machine, the bad coffee. The only coffee. The coffee that tasted the same at 6 a.m. as it did at midnight, and had probably been brewed during the previous fiscal year. She held one out. Mark took it. "You're keeping her," she said. He drank, burnt, lukewarm. Exactly what it always was. "Yeah." Sarah leaned against the frame, drank her own, said nothing else. Somewhere in the administrative wing, Richard DeMero had a calendar open on his desk and was counting hours. Somewhere in room 312, Harold Jennings was asleep for the 2nd consecutive afternoon. The faint sound of puppies threading through the walls like a frequency tuned to something only he could receive. And in 22 hours, the 48 would be up. Mark stood in the sterilization room holding bad coffee and a decision. And he knew that the next day would ask him to defend it. The van pulled into the visitor lot at 8:14 a.m. on the 3rd morning. White, clean. King County Animal Control Services printed on the side panel in dark blue professional. Neutral. The kind of lettering designed to say authority without saying threat. It parked between a dented Subaru and a minivan with a faded soccer sticker peeling off the bumper. 2 officers stepped out, a man and a woman, both in khaki, both moving with the unhurried efficiency of people on a routine call. The woman name tag reading D. Orozco checked the address against her clipboard. The man pulled 2 transport crates from the back and set them on the asphalt. 1 large, 1 medium. Standard equipment, standard morning. Richard DeMero met them at the east entrance. Handshake with Orozco. A brief exchange. Mark couldn't hear from 30 feet down the corridor. Then Richard led them toward the sterilization room. His stride measured and deliberate. His hand going to his tie knot 3 times in 40 feet. Adjusting what didn't need adjusting. A small tell, the only one he had. Mark was already there. Had been since 7. Since Sarah's text 2 words. They called. He stood with his back to the wall outside the sterilization room door. Arms at his sides. Still in yesterday's scrubs because he hadn't left. His eyes tracked the 3 figures coming down the corridor. Inside the room, Bella knew before the door opened. Not the van, not the crates, not the paperwork. The shift. Footsteps quicker than usual, voices with edges. The particular change in air pressure that runs through a building when something is about to be taken from a place it has settled into. She stood. Slowly, the hind leg was always worst in the mornings. The damaged knee stiff and reluctant after hours on the floor. The IV line tugged. She backed into the far corner and positioned herself between the wall and the puppies. 5 bodies, eyes still sealed, piled in the nest of towels and Eleanor's blanket. Bella stood over them with her front legs spread, her torn ear flat against her skull. The same geometry as the concrete step. Retreat, distance, refusal to leave. Beckett was kneeling beside the IV stand when the door opened. She looked up, saw Richard, saw the khaki, saw the clipboard. She rose, stepped between the officers and Bella, arms crossed, 1 glove on, 1 off. Her work interrupted mid-task. "That dog is under active veterinary treatment," she said, not loud, didn't need to be. "She's 3 days into a 5-day IV antibiotic course for deep tissue infection following surgical debridement. You load her into a transport crate, pull that line, and put her in a van with no climate control. She goes into septic shock before you hit the freeway. That's not a removal, that's an animal cruelty incident. And I'll file the complaint myself before your van clears the parking lot." Orozco looked at her clipboard, looked at Beckett. The call had come in as a routine stray removal. Nobody had mentioned IV lines or surgical debridement or antibiotic courses or veterinarians who use the words animal cruelty the way lawyers use the words due process. "We'll need to make a call," Orozco said. "Take your time," Beckett said. She didn't move, but it was borrowed time. A phone call to the county veterinary office would produce an authorization. The crates would come in. Bella and the puppies would go to a county facility where a 30-day clock would start. And Mark knew what happened when 30-day clocks ran out. The news found its way through St. Jude, the way all urgent things found their way through St. Jude, carried room to room by the nurses who moved between them, passed in the shorthand of people who share a building's pulse. "They're here for the dog. Animal control." They brought crates. Orozco was on her phone in the corridor, waiting for the county office to open at 9. Her partner stood near the sterilization room door, arms folded, professional, patient. Richard had gone back to his office to field what he expected would be the first of several calls. 15 minutes passed, then 20. Eleanor Calloway came around the corner first. Wheelchair, hospital gown. The IV pole she was still tethered to rattling behind her across the linoleum. One wheel squeaking on every rotation. Her face was set in the particular expression of a woman who had raised 4 children, buried a husband, outlived a hip, and had stopped tolerating things that didn't make sense roughly 2 decades ago. Arthur Briggs followed. Wheelchair, bathrobe, slippers whispering on the floor. Then Margaret from 304 pneumonia recovery, pushing her own IV stand with one hand, the other flat against the wall for balance. Then a man Mark didn't recognize, thin, pale, hospital bracelet still on, walking slowly, but walking. They didn't organize, didn't form a line, didn't block the hallway with any intention that could be named or disciplined. They just arrived one after another, settling into the corridor the way sparrows settle on a wire, each finding a spot without coordination or discussion, some in wheelchairs, some against walls. Margaret lowered herself into a hallway chair, folded her hands in her lap, and regarded the 2 animal control officers with the unhurried patience of someone who had absolutely nowhere else to be, and all day to prove it. 12 people, maybe 15, old and slow and sick and quiet, filling the corridor with nothing but the fact of themselves. Richard came back from his office, turned the corner, stopped. Orozco lowered her phone. She had been mid-dial. She looked at the corridor, looked at her partner. Her partner looked at the old woman in the wheelchair with the IV pole and said nothing. Eleanor's eyes found Richard. She had known him since before the gray in his hair. He was the administrator who had processed her husband Tom's hospice transfer in this same wing. 7 years ago, she had sent him a Christmas card every December since even the years she forgot other people. Richard. Her voice didn't rise. It carried the way voices carry when they don't need volume because they have weight. "I've been coming to this hospital 30 years. Don't you make me ashamed of it today." The corridor held still. Fluorescent hum. The faint mewing of puppies behind the closed door. Nothing else. Mark stepped forward. He had a folded piece of paper in his hand written at 5 that morning on the floor of the sterilization room while Bella slept. Handwritten. Creased. The pen strokes of a man running on 30 hours without sleep and a decision he'd made holding bad coffee. "I'll take full responsibility," he said. "Financial, legal, all of it. Laura Beckett continues treatment here, pro bono, until the antibiotic course is finished. Then I take her home, her and all 5. He held out the paper. "She needs 3 more days on the IV. That's all I'm asking." Richard took the paper, read it. Personal liability, financial responsibility, veterinary supervision. Mark's signature at the bottom. Slightly unsteady. Richard looked up, looked past Mark at the corridor, Eleanor in her wheelchair, Arthur in his bathrobe, Margaret with her hands folded, the thin man he didn't recognize, leaning against the wall and watching him with quiet, steady eyes. He folded the paper, slid it into his breast pocket. 3 days, he said, quiet. "And when the county calls, I'm giving them your number, not mine." "Fair enough." Richard turned to Orozco. Spoke briefly. Mark couldn't hear the words. Only the tone, administrative, final. Orozco nodded. She and her partner gathered the clipboard, walked back down the corridor past the patients, past the wheelchairs, past Eleanor, who watched them go with her hands resting on the arms of her chair and her chin slightly raised. The van pulled out of the visitor lot at 9:03 a.m. The corridor emptied slowly. Margaret needed help standing. Arthur's wheelchair squeaked on the turn. Eleanor sat where she was for another minute, looking at the closed door of the sterilization room, before she patted the arm of her chair twice and said to no one in particular, "All right, then." In room 312, Harold Jennings was sitting on the edge of his bed. He had heard it, more footsteps than usual, more voices, a density of sound that meant something was happening in the building. He had pressed his call button. No one came. They were all in the east corridor. He gripped the bed rail, pulled himself upright. His legs took his weight barely, the muscles wasted from months of minimal movement. His blood pressure dropping as he stood, a gray haze swimming across his vision. He held the rail until it passed. Found the IV pole with his other hand. Steadied. 1 step. His slippers found the cold floor. Another. The IV pole rolled beside him, the wheels catching once on the door track before clearing. He stood in his doorway, not in the corridor. Not yet. Just the threshold, and looked down the hall toward the sound he had been listening to for 3 nights. His hand trembled on the pole. His breath came short. But he was standing, and he was facing the right direction. Day 6. Beckett removed the IV line at 7 in the morning. Checked the wound margins one final time, pink, granulating, the sweet smell gone, and handed Mark a paper bag. 14 days of oral antibiotics, a wound care kit, and a printed instruction sheet with her handwriting across the bottom. Twice a day with food. Don't skip. Don't forget. I will know. Mark carried Bella to his car in the east lot. She was heavier now. 5 days of fluids and nutrition had put enough weight back that he couldn't count every rib through the coat. Enough. Not healthy. Just enough. The puppies rode in a cardboard box wedged into the passenger footwell, towels lining the bottom. A hot water bottle Sarah had tucked underneath without comment. Sarah stood in the parking lot with her arms crossed and watched him load the car the way she watched everything, assessing. Efficient. Already calculating what might go wrong. "Call if you need anything," she said. "I will. You won't, but I said it." He pulled out at 7:34 and turned west on Route 518. The drive took 22 minutes. He knew every turn the way the body knows a route the mind has abandoned, left on Ambom. Right on 152nd, past the Safeway where Claire bought the yogurt she liked. The one in the glass jar that cost twice what the plastic ones did. Past the elementary school where they'd talked once about enrollment timelines, a conversation that had become irrelevant in a single November night. He turned into the driveway. The grass was past his ankles. The mailbox was stuffed catalogs, utility bills, a coupon flyer addressed to Claire Sullivan or current resident. He left it. The front door stuck. It always stuck in wet weather. The wood swelling in Seattle's permanent damp. He shouldered it the way he always shouldered it. Except this time he was holding a 65-pound dog and listening to 5 puppies cry behind him in a cardboard box. The door gave. The smell came first, not rot, not neglect, just absence. The smell of air that hasn't circulated. Dust on every horizontal surface. The particular staleness of a house where someone pays the mortgage but doesn't live. Claire's raincoat hung on the hook by the door. Blue. The belt still knotted the way she'd left it. Her shoes, brown ankle boots, the one she wore to school, sat on the mat below. Toes pointed outward, as though she'd just stepped out of them and would step back in at any moment. The coffee mug was in the kitchen sink. White ceramic. A small chip on the rim. A faint ring of dried brown inside, where the last cup of coffee she'd ever poured had evaporated over 730 days. Mark had washed every other dish, kept the kitchen otherwise clean on the rare nights he used it. But the mug stayed, because washing it was a kind of ending. And he wasn't ready for endings. He had never put that into words. His hands simply refused. Bella walked the house, nose to the floor, reading the air the way dogs read everything by scent, by particle, by the invisible history that clings to carpet and furniture and the underside of doors. She moved through the living room, the kitchen, the hallway. She stopped at the closed bedroom door, sniffed the gap at the bottom along. Deliberate inhale. Then she lay down across the threshold, her body blocking the door she couldn't open, chin on her paws. Mark set the puppy box beside the fireplace, turned on the heat, stood in the middle of the living room and looked at his house, not through memory, through the flat gray light of a Tuesday morning in March, the way a stranger would see it, the way a real estate agent would see it, the way anyone would see it who didn't know the story and just saw the dust, the dead air, the woman's coat still hanging by the door. A museum, that's what he had built. A museum dedicated to a woman who had been dead for 2 years. Curated by a man who visited occasionally to sleep on the couch before driving back to the place where he actually lived, which was not this house but a hospital, where he could fill every hour with someone else's emergency and never sit still long enough for his own to find him. His phone rang at 8:47 p.m. He was sitting at the kitchen table, the first time he'd sat at this table since the night before Claire's C-section, when they'd eaten takeout Thai and she'd laughed about something he could no longer remember, which was worse than forgetting her face because at least he had photographs of her face. Bella lay on the floor beside his chair. The puppies were asleep in their box. The house was dark except for the light above the stove. His father, Frank Sullivan, 76, retired pipe fitter, widowed 11 years. They talked every 2 weeks: health, weather, the Mariners, silence, goodbye. The rhythm so fixed that any deviation would feel like a crack in a foundation. Tonight, Frank deviated. "Your mother's been gone 11 years, he said. Slow, not hesitant, deliberate. Each word placed the way he used to place pipe joints. By feel and fit. I still said her place at dinner, fork, knife, glass of water, every night. Stupid, right. Mark said nothing. But I sit at the damn table, "Son." The line went quiet. Mark could hear his father's breathing. The television behind him. Wheel of Fortune. The clatter of the wheel. Audience applause. Then the click. Frank hung up the way he always did, no goodbye. The call ending mid-silence as though it had simply run out of pavement. Mark sat in the dark with the dead phone pressed to his ear. The stove light hummed. Bella breathed against his ankle. The puppies shifted in their box. Small, wet sounds from creatures who hadn't yet learned what the world was. His father set a place every night. Fork, knife, glass of water, for a woman 11 years gone, and sat down across from the empty chair and ate his dinner. Mark hadn't sat at his own kitchen table in 2 years, hadn't opened the bedroom door, hadn't washed the mug. He had driven to the hospital every morning and put his hands inside other people's bodies and repaired what was broken. And then he had come back here and slept on the couch with his shoes on and left again before the sky got light. 2 years. He had called it dedication. He had let the nurses call it brave, the surgeon who channeled his grief into saving lives. The quiet man who worked doubles because the work sustained him. He had believed it himself, or he had needed to believe it, which was the same thing until it wasn't. His hands found the edge of the table. Gripped. The wood was cold and dusty and unused beneath his fingers. This table, where Claire had spread her lesson plans 4th grade, Hazel Valley Elementary, and complained about a boy named Declan who couldn't stay in his seat. This table, where they'd argued about nursery colors, where they'd eaten that last Thai dinner, and she'd laughed. He let go. His hands dropped to his lap. Open, empty. The puppies cried a brief, synchronized burst of mewing, then quieted. Bella didn't stir. Her breathing held steady against his ankle, warm through the fabric of his scrub pants. Mark slid off the chair, sat on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinet, legs stretched out, palms flat on linoleum that was cold and faintly gritty with 2 years of a life not being lived. He sat in the dark and looked at the room at the table, the mug in the sink, the raincoat visible through the kitchen doorway, and there was nowhere left. Not the hospital, not the operating room, not the night shifts and the double shifts and the identity he'd constructed out of competence and exhaustion. None of it was large enough to stand between him and what was sitting in this kitchen, in this dark, in this silence. He had not been strong. He had been hiding. Hiding in the hospital the way a child hides under a blanket, not because the blanket stops anything, but because it blocks the view. He had hidden behind the title and the schedule and the scrubs and the steady hands, and the whole time this house had been waiting, exactly as Claire had left it, asking a question he had refused to hear for 730 days. And now he was on the floor, in the dark, in the house he'd abandoned. And the only living thing that knew he was here was a dog with a torn ear and a broken leg, lying against his ankle because she had nowhere else to go either. His hand found Bella's ear, the torn one, and rested there. He didn't stroke, just held. Her warmth moved through his palm and into his wrist, and settled somewhere behind his ribs, where something very cold had been sitting for a very long time. The stove light hummed, the puppies breathed, and Mark Sullivan sat on his kitchen floor with no place left to hide, and nothing between him and the quiet except the sound of 5 small hearts beating in a cardboard box. He woke on the kitchen floor at 4:51 a.m., neck locked at an angle that sent a wire of pain from his skull to his left shoulder blade. Back rigid. The linoleum had pressed its cold into him through the night, into his hip bones and his spine, and the backs of his hands where they'd rested. Open, on the floor. The puppies were crying, small, insistent, overlapping the sound of hunger that has no concept of patience, that knows only now and need and nothing beyond. 5 voices, thin as wire. Bella was already up. He heard her before he saw her, the click-drag of her uneven gait crossing the kitchen in the gray light before dawn. She passed within a foot of his outstretched legs without stopping, reached the box by the fireplace, stepped over the cardboard edge, careful on the bad leg, and lowered herself onto her side. The crying stopped as 5 mouths found her. Mark sat up, watched. This dog, torn ear, scarred flank, knee that would never bend right, wound on her belly, still closing under gauze. She had been beaten with something narrow and hard, starved, left to rot from the inside out. She had walked to a hospital on a leg that shouldn't have carried her, and scratched on a glass door at 3 a.m. because 5 lives depended on her getting there. And she was up before him, not because anyone woke her, not because anyone helped her to her feet, because the box was crying. And that was enough. That was the entire calculation need. Rise, go, and she had made it without hesitation. On 3 good legs and 1 that wasn't. In a stranger's kitchen. In the dark. Mark pressed his palms flat on the linoleum and pushed himself to standing. His knees popped. His back seized and released. He was 42 years old with 2 working legs, and he had slept on a kitchen floor, and he felt every minute of it in every joint. He walked to the sink. The mug sat where it had sat for 730 days. White ceramic. Chip on the rim. The brown ring inside the tide line of the last cup of coffee Claire Sullivan had ever poured. Evaporated to a stain that marked the exact boundary between the morning she was alive and every morning after. Mark turned on the faucet. Cold first, then warm. He picked up the mug. It was lighter than he'd made it in his mind. Just a cup. Just the ceramic and glaze. 12 ounces of nothing carrying 2 years of everything he couldn't say. He held it under the water. The brown ring softened, loosened. He rubbed the inside with his thumb. No sponge. Just skin on ceramic, and watched the stain dissolve and spiral down the drain. Tannin and calcium and time. Reduced to nothing by warm water in a man's hand. He dried it with the dish towel that hung from the oven handle. Opened the cabinet above the coffee maker. Set Claire's mug on the second shelf next to his, the blue one with the chipped handle where it had always stood. Side by side, where it belonged, not in the sink, preserved in the residue of a last morning. On the shelf, clean, among the other cups. Part of the kitchen again, instead of a monument in it. He closed the cabinet, stood with his hand on the knob, breathed, then he walked to the bedroom door. Bella was still nursing by the fireplace, the puppy's small sounds filling the house. Mark put his hand on the doorknob. The metal was cold. He turned it. The room smelled like Claire. Faint, 2 years of sealed air had thinned it to nearly nothing but there. Her perfume, the one she wore every day, the name of which he'd never learned but would recognize anywhere. It lived in the pillow, the curtains, the quilt she'd ordered from a catalog the year they moved in. He crossed the room, opened the window. March air came in damp, cool, carrying wet grass and the neighbor's cedar fence, and the distant sound of a truck on 152nd. The curtains moved. The room took a breath it had been holding for 2 years. Mark stood at the sill with both hands on the wood. The sky over the backyard was gray. Seattle gray, the gray that doesn't promise anything but doesn't lie about it either. He drove to St. Jude, parked in his usual spot. walked through the east entrance, carrying two things: a stapled 4-page document and a box of donuts from the bakery on 152nd that the nursing staff had been mentioning for months. Richard's office. Mark knocked, entered, set the donuts on the filing cabinet and the document on the desk. Richard picked it up, reading glasses low on his nose. He turned pages: a proposal for a therapy dog program for long-term patients. 3 published studies cited. 1 from Johns Hopkins, attached the week's nursing notes. Eleanor's improved mobility scores. Arthur Briggs' reduced anxiety episodes. And a single line from the chart of room 312, copied in Mark's handwriting. Patient slept 4 consecutive hours. Unprompted, no medication. First occurrence in 14 months. Richard set the document down, looked at Mark over his glasses. "You look like you actually went home last night." "I did, first time in a while." Richard picked up his pen, turned it between his fingers, looked at the nursing note from room 312 again, the word unprompted. "I'll need to take this to the board," he said, "but I'll put my name on the recommendation." He signed the last page, set the pen down. "Don't make me regret it." Mark took the document, walked out, past the nurse's station, where Sarah looked up and saw something different in his face and said nothing because it wasn't the kind of different that needed words. Past room 308, where Arthur Briggs was watching the Weather Channel with the volume on for the first time anyone could remember. Past room 312, where Harold Jennings was sitting on the edge of his bed with his feet on the floor, looking at the open door with the expression of a man waiting for something he couldn't name but had started. Against all evidence and habit, to expect 6 months, 4 months of recovery and training, a stack of certification paperwork that made Richard's filing cabinet groan, a board vote that passed 4-1, the lone dissent from a member who was allergic to dogs and voted on principle. Bella's coat had filled in thick, dark, glossy where it grew over undamaged skin, white along the scar lines on her right flank where the hair came back a different color, mapping her history in a pattern only she and the people who knew her could read. A patch of thin, newer fur covered her left flank where Beckett's scalpel had done its work softer than the rest, growing in slightly uneven, the body's way of closing a chapter without erasing it. Her left ear was still torn. Beckett had offered to trim it, make it neat. Mark said no. Sarah said no louder. The hind leg still pulled, always would. The knee had healed wrong long before anyone who cared had gotten to it, and no surgery could undo what bone had already decided on its own. Bella walked with a hitch, click, step, step. Click, step, step, a rhythm the East Corridor nurses had learned to identify from 50 feet away. Some reached for the treats Sarah had started stocking in the supply closet, filed between the gauze pads and the tongue depressors, labeled in Sarah's handwriting, "Dog, do not eat. This means you, Gerald." Bella wore a blue vest. Therapy dog, St. Jude Memorial Hospital. Velcro straps, a laminated ID clipped to the front with her photo, and Beckett's certification number. She walked the corridors beside Mark on his rounds, not every room, not every patient. Some were allergic, some were afraid, some simply didn't want a dog near them. And Bella seemed to know the difference, pausing at certain doors and passing others, guided by whatever calculation dogs run that no one has ever decoded. The puppies had found homes. The first 2 went to a pediatric nurse, and her firefighter husband, Mark, got photos every week of 2 German Shepherd pups methodically dismantling a living room couch. The 3rd and 4th went to families he'd vetted himself, a retired couple in Burien, a single mother in White Center whose 7-year-old had written a letter in purple crayon requesting the brown one with the big paws, Sarah kept the fifth, the smallest, the one who had taken 15 seconds to breathe. Her son named him Pepper. And Pepper slept at the foot of the boy's bed every night with his legs hanging off the edge. On a Tuesday night in September, Mark walked his evening rounds with Bella beside him. The corridor was quiet, 10:15. Shift to change, smell fresh coffee from the nurse's station layered over the permanent antiseptic that lived in the linoleum. Bella's claws ticked beside him, steady and even on the polished floor. Room 312. The door was open. The light was on. It was always on at this hour. Some habits outlasting the reasons that made them. But Harold Jennings was not sitting upright staring at the window. He was lying on his side, facing the door, one hand resting on the blanket. Bella stopped at the threshold. She did this at every room, paused, read the air, waited. Harold saw her, lifted his hand 2 inches off the blanket, patted the mattress beside his hip. Twice, slow. Bella walked in, jumped onto the bed carefully, the hind leg making the maneuver graceless, and lay down along Harold's side. Her back pressed against his stomach. Her head settled on the mattress near his hand. Harold's fingers found the spot between her ears. He stroked once, twice. His hand trembled. It always trembled now. A fine motor deficit the cardiologist blamed on medication and age, but his touch was slow and deliberate and sure. He was quiet for a long time. Bella's breathing dropped into the deep even rhythm of a dog at rest. The monitors counted their slow count. The fluorescent hummed its half note. "Had a dog," Harold said. His voice was rough from disuse, low, the words coming out unevenly. "Back in '69, Shepherd." He stopped. His fingers kept moving. "Like you." A pause. He swallowed. "They shipped me out, and I didn't." The sentence stalled. He took a breath. "Let it go." "I didn't get to say anything to him. Just gone, one morning. Just gone." His hand stilled on Bella's head, then started again. 45 years. You believe that?" His voice had thinned. 45 years, and I still wonder if he waited at the door. Bella didn't move. Her breathing rose and fell against Harold's ribs. Outside the window, the parking lot lights made their orange pools on the wet asphalt. A car passed on the road, then quiet. Harold closed his eyes. His fingers stayed where they were. At 6 the next morning, the night nurse made her final rounds. She opened 312 and found Harold asleep deeply, completely. His face slack in a way she had never seen in 14 months of charting his sleeplessness. Bella lay beside him, awake, her eyes tracking the nurse as she stepped in. The dog didn't move. The old man's hand rested on her neck. The nurse checked the monitors, checked the time, wrote in the chart. Patient slept through the night. No episodes, no call button. Therapy dog present. First full night of unbroken sleep in 14 months of admission. She underlined the last line. Moved on, 2 floors up. Mark Sullivan walked the 3rd-floor corridor, east wing, past radiology, past the supply closet, past 301, 302, 303. He reached the stretch outside the maternity ward. The stretch where, for 2 years, his legs had carried him faster without his permission. His body routing around the door his mind couldn't face. He stopped, hands at his sides. He looked through the glass. Inside, a young woman sat in the rocking chair by the window, her newborn held against her chest. The baby's fist was curled around the collar of her gown. The woman's eyes were closed. Morning light fell across them, both warm, angled. The first real sun in days. Mark watched. 10 seconds. 15. His chest was tight, but his breathing stayed even. Bella was beside his left leg. Her nose touched his hand, dry, warm. The same nose that had pressed against his knee on a concrete step 6 months ago. He looked down, scratched the spot between her ears. She leaned into his palm. He turned, walked on. Not faster, not slower. The same even pace as every other step in the corridor. At the far end of the hallway, the vending machine dropped a can with its familiar thunk. The radio in the nurse's station was playing something old Patsy Cline, maybe, or something close to it. Too faint from here to tell. Morning light came through the corridor windows, gray and soft. Seattle in September, no different from Seattle in March. But the man walking through it was. Sometimes a story leaves something behind that's hard to name. Not a thought. Exactly. More like a weight, quiet. Familiar. Settled somewhere in the chest where words don't quite reach. Many of us know what it is to keep a cup in the sink, a coat on a hook, a door closed because opening it means admitting what's on the other side. Some of us have set a place at the table for someone who won't be sitting down, and done it anyway, night after night. Because love doesn't stop being love just because the chair is empty. Some of us have carried something heavy for so long that we forgot we were carrying it until a small, unexpected kindness reminded us it was there. Not everything needs to be understood. Some things just need to be held for a while. Gently, the way you'd hold something bruised, and then allowed to rest. Thank you for staying with this story. Thank you for listening all the way to the end.